Okay. Great. So welcome. My name is Maureen O'Connell. I am new on the Discerning Deacons team, or new as of the middle of June. And I've been hired to join the team to continue to help Discerning Deacons serve the Synod, recognizing that this is a very historic moment in our church. This is in some ways an unprecedented listening campaign that is going on in the church, and we don't want to miss this moment to sort of witness to the kind of church that we hope to become through this synod process. And so the hope for women and women's leadership is one of the hopes that's caught up in the synod process. But if any of you were involved in listening sessions, you know that there are a multitude of hopes and dreams that the people of God have for our church. And it's the hope of these folks that this synod process is going to be the way that we realize those dreams together. So Discerning Deacons, Ellie and Casey in their wisdom thought it was important to have somebody on the team dedicated to continuing to put Discerning Deacons at the service of the synod. So I'm really excited to be in that role. And my goal for us tonight is really just to share why I think this synod provides us a really important opportunity to take some steps towards anti-racism, or let's put it this way, anti-racist steps together towards racial justice in our global church, but particularly in our American church. I want to give you a couple definitions of racism and anti-racism using some of Pope Francis's language. He has been more bold and more comfortable addressing this reality of racism in the global church and in naming it in the American church. But he has some interesting phrases for it, and I want to share them with you and just invite you to continue to maybe think about them and pray with them. I want to give you some suggestions for how maybe we can be anti-racist in the next phase of the synod. As I said earlier, the synod continues to unfold. And now's the time to be intentional with how we walk together, particularly here in the American church. And then we'll close. I think we have Anna Robertson, who's our new organizer. I know that I saw her among our smiling faces. She's going to close out with a couple of announcements about things that are happening in Discerning Deacons, if you don't know already. I suspect you do, but Anna's going to kind of fill you in. Okay, so that's our plan for this evening. And I think I've just enabled closed captioning, so hopefully you can see that. This is the first trying that, so that's great. So let's open with our synod prayer. I might ask for a volunteer to perhaps read our synod prayer for us. I'm going to enter into present mode. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. Is everybody able to see it? Yes, wonderful. So could I ask for a volunteer just to read? This is the prayer that is opening all of the synod listening sessions all over the world. And you could just speak up because I can't see everyone. So a volunteer.
I can do it.
Wonderful.
We stand before you, Holy Spirit, as we gather together in your name. With you alone to guide us, make yourself at home in our hearts. Teach us the way we must go and how we are to pursue it. We are weak and sinful. Do not let us promote disorder. Do not let ignorance lead us down the wrong path, nor partiality influence our actions. Let us find in you our unity, so that we may journey together to eternal life and not stray from the way of truth and what is right. All this we ask of you, who are at work in every place and time, in the communion of the Father and the Son, forever and ever. Amen.
Wonderful. And I think that was Pat. Was that Pat?
Yes.
Wonderful. Great. I need to there we go. Okay, let me bring you all back. Thanks, Pat. Okay, so let me just begin with giving you a little bit about who I am and why I am engaged in initially racial justice work and now in Discerning Deacons synodal work. So as I said before, I'm Maureen O'Connell. I'm the new Director of Synod and Higher Ed Engagement for Discerning Deacons. And that's now my new full-time thing. And I have a part-time thing, which used to be my full-time thing. And that's being a professor of Christian ethics at LaSalle University in Philadelphia. LaSalle's a Christian Brothers school in the northwest corner of Philadelphia. I've been there for 9 years. Prior to that, I was at Fordham University in New York City for 8 years. And then prior to that, I was in graduate school at Boston College. I earned my PhD in theological ethics at Boston College, working with the feminist ethicist Lisa Cahill. Some of you might recognize her name. I have been trained, it was while I was at Fordham that I was really introduced to anti-racist work through a really neat collaborative effort there at Fordham. And so I was trained by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. So I've had a few trainings with them. I highly recommend them as a really good resource for learning the ongoing journey, how to walk the ongoing path of becoming anti-racist. I also was trained through Faith in Action, which is an international network of faith-based organizations. I was trained through their national training in anti-racism work. And then my own LaSalle University has offered on a regular basis a lot of different training. So to my mind, this is work that never ends, and it is an ongoing formation process for those of us, especially for those of us who are white. I teach courses at LaSalle on theology and race, theology and racism. So I've done that a number of times. And I think most importantly, perhaps for our conversation today, I just in January published a book with Beacon Press. And so I'm going to share my screen again, just so that I can do a little bit of self-promoting. But my book with Beacon Press just came out in January. Hopefully you can see it. It's called Undoing the Knots: 5 Generations of American Catholic Anti-Blackness. And that book was a good, 5 or 6 years in the making. But the main impulse for trying to write it really came with me trying to wrestle with why it is that I feel so underprepared and ill-equipped as a white Catholic woman, even with all of the theological education I have, all of the education in general I have, all of the faith formation I've received. Why do I still feel so underprepared and ill-equipped to engage in racial justice work? And so this was my attempt to go back as far as I could in my family history in the United States and figure out, what did I inherit? What did I learn? How were the people and generations before me formed as American Catholics, as white American Catholics? And if I'm honest with you, the title changed not far into doing some of this archival research. Initially, I was thinking that the title was going to be about how we became white. But the more I studied and the more I learned, the more I really had to really own and acknowledge that in my family's experience, we didn't just become white in America as Catholics. Our Catholicism formed us to be anti-Black, to be very suspicious of, fearful of Black people in particular, because this is a story that unfolds in Philadelphia, and to hold Black people at arm's length and to distance ourselves whenever possible from Black people. So this was my attempt to really wrestle with that reality. So again, let me just try to bring you all back. And I don't know. Normally I'm able to do that. There you are. So a story that motivated me in writing the book, but I think also motivates the work that I think we are attempting to do in this synod process, or we could commit ourselves to doing in the second part of this synod process, comes from a classroom experience I had in 2016. And I was teaching that theology and racism course, and it was the fall of 2016. So we all remember how tough that fall was. And in my class, we had done a lot of work to build relationships and connections. It was a class where half of the students were students of color, half were white students. And we had done a lot of work to try to build relationships of trust. And we found ourselves sort of stuck and getting really tense around the all lives matter rejoinder to the Black Lives Matter affirmation. And I could see things kind of breaking apart. I could see tensions starting to erupt in the classroom. I could see people shutting down. I could see these common defensive postures arriving. And a Black student in that class said the most prophetic thing, and it still resonates with me, and it's still a lesson that I bring forward in a lot of the work I do in classrooms or in writing, and now in the synod. And this student basically said to all of us, you know, when it comes to racism, I just wish people would believe me. I just wish people would believe me. And that really, like a pin could drop in the room. And that was unfortunately a really prophetic statement. And so for the rest of the semester, I really spent a lot of intentional energy trying to figure out what kind of conditions do I need to make in this space so that the students and me could believe Jahi. And then I found myself interrogating, well, why is it sometimes that I find myself not able to believe him or not wanting to believe him or to respond to Jahi or Black people like him with my own, yeah, but what about, yeah, but how is it that I'm so defensive around that? And so in some ways, that is a disposition that I think we need to bring with us. I know that I'm trying to bring with me into this synod work. I think the synod is an unprecedented opportunity, at least for me, to integrate two things that are really important to me in my vocation: feminist ethics and racial justice, right? To bring those two things together in a firm commitment, to create conditions where we can believe one another, that we can learn from what we hear, and that we can commit to walking together to figure out how together to address some of the wounds and the pains that we hear from our communities of color, the people of color in our lives. So this is, I feel like this is the moment. So in some ways, at first I was thinking I was putting the racial justice work kind of over to the side, and I had somebody say, no, this is the time. This is precisely the kind of thing, sensibility, ways of trying to engage and relate, being intentional about walking a path together that we need in this moment in the church. And I think there are at least two reasons why I think we need to be intentional about being anti-racist in any kind of synodal work: listening, discerning, dialoguing here certainly in our global church, but most definitely in our American church. And the first is, like, we have a church whose past is defined by wounds of racism, and that the church has been at the heart of the racial project across the globe and in the United States, right? To define people by racial identity, and then to rank people and assign people worth by their racial identity. And I think that's something that we have to own and acknowledge in this synodal moment, in this synodal process and time. So I think we saw Pope Francis start to do that around the wounds and the pains experienced by Indigenous populations in Canada with his recent visit this summer there. And also at the same time heard very clearly from communities there that, yes, that was the first step, and that there have to be many steps taken from there, but that was an important first step. So we have to acknowledge this history, and this is a moment, this synodal moment is a time to do that. The second reason I think we need to do it is that our imaginations have been stunted by racism in the United States. Our ability to dream what might be have really been held captive by racism. So our ability to imagine what might be possible in our church needs to be broken open, needs to be unleashed. And it really needs to be unleashed by believing the folks on the margins who know that a different way of being church and a different path is possible. And committing ourselves both to believing and following those folks, right? So this is the whole idea in the synod process of decentering the center. It's because the imagination at the center is really limited and stunted. So I think the synod can provide an excuse for some of us who have already been doing this work. And it seems like there are many folks on the call tonight who have been doing racial justice work in your own context, in your parish context, or maybe in your classroom context or in a youth ministry context. It's an excuse to be really unapologetic and explicit about wanting to be anti-racist in this work. And in a couple minutes, I'll give you a couple ideas about what that might be. And then also, I think if we at Discerning Deacons are operating with the radical hope that this is the moment in the church's history to believe women and what women are saying to the church about their contributions, about their call to leadership and ministry, and the desire to be acknowledged with just responses of the church, then it's also the moment for discerning deacons to believe the way that the church has historically marginalized people of color and to follow their lead in believing them, acknowledging their contributions to the church, working for their justice. It's like they're two sides of the same coin. So that's a little bit of the why behind why I think that this is a particularly important moment for us in the church to do this work. So let me give you a couple little ideas about this, about notions of race that come from Francis, and then we'll have a chance to get into some groups and talk a little bit, and then come back. The synod is more than just an event. It really is an opportunity for us to create a new culture in our church. And I hear Francis, and maybe some of you have read Let Us Dream. I don't know if people are familiar with this, or like I see some nodding heads, right? Let Us Dream. He has a concept in here that I think really captures racism in a way that helps those of us who put up walls or have a hard time because the white noise kicks up and the defensive noise kicks up in our heads and we can't really process what's being said. Francis talks about isolated consciences, that we need to move from a culture of isolated consciences to a culture, and he doesn't say this, but I'm kind of putting these two words together for him because he actually does in lots of different places, to a culture of people who conspire together to be protagonists for change. And to my mind, those are two really great ways of thinking about racism: isolated consciences and anti-racism, co-conspirators for change or conspiring protagonists. So let me just give you a thought or two about this from Francis, right? He thinks about isolated consciences as being rigid, people who are rigid, who are inflexible, who are closed in on their own interests and closed off to maybe what is going on around them, who are threatened by any kind of difference and take up defensive postures around things that they don't understand. There are folks who are really confident in what they know to be true and aren't really porous enough to receive other perspectives on truth. Rigid consciences reduce people to functions, the functions that they can serve for other people. They cling, and here's a quote, a rigid consciences, and this is a quote from Francis, they cling to something petty, something that they fear to lose, something that feeds their ego, power, influence, freedom, security, money, property. All of these are things that a rigid conscience clings to. And those with a rigid conscience are not willing to get into the fray. They're not willing to do their work. Perhaps it's because there's fear, perhaps because they really don't want change or meaningful change. But to my mind, a lot of those qualities of the rigid conscience are really the qualities that we might recognize in cultures of white supremacy, right? Having a rigid binary worldview, reducing people to particular traits, either racial traits or gendered traits, a strong focus on authority and organizing society hierarchically, a sense that you are right by default, right? That your experience is the norm against which everyone else's is defined. That yours is an inheritance to be protected at all costs. That you approach others mostly with fear and suspicion and defensiveness and a desire to control. All of those are qualities or characteristics of cultures of white supremacy, right? So in this invitation to move beyond that, Francis is calling us into this synod process, into cultures of encounter, where eventually we become protagonists, right? And to Kathy's question about what's the source, right? Here's the source of this. It's from Francis's Let Us Dream. It's a really beautiful book. In some ways, this is his vision of synod before it really kind of hit the ground. So on the opposite, if Francis is then calling, if we're trying to move away from these cultures of a rigid conscience, he's calling us instead in the synod process to become conspiring protagonists. And what I want to offer to us tonight is that if we do this intentionally, we can be anti-racist in the way we do our synodality, right? So he says that protagonists are people who act in the end, right? They are people who engage in sharing and active listening and discernment. Protagonism is an active state. And that protagonists, at least to his understanding in the synod process, are really about trying to decenter their own power. So it's not about a protagonism that reinforces the individual, but a protagonism, and Casey said this earlier today, so I'm going to quote her, a protagonism that helps us experience what it's like to be part of a people, another big, wide, expansive group of people walking the same path together. When we talk about conspiring protagonists, we're talking about people who literally breathe together. And if we think about spirit and breath, it's about calling in, invoking, and having confidence and putting faith in the spirit together as being something that we're collectively discerning. And then that spirit creates expansiveness. If a rigid conscience is constricted and narrow and has no room to breathe, as maybe many of us feel sometimes when we're caught up in racially charged incidents or trying to navigate all of the horrors and wounds of racism that are everywhere in our reality, the idea of this conspiring protagonism creates space, right? So there's not the fear necessarily of making a mistake, because the goal is not to be right, but to work together towards something that we've discerned as a goal that we share. And that we operate with a confidence that we can get there because we've acknowledged the gifts that have been brought around the table to do that, right? So it's quite frankly the opposite of operating as an individual. And conspiring is not about looking through the lens of deficit or need, which is something that racism has done to us, especially those of us who are white. We look out at the world in terms of what everyone else needs. Conspiring protagonists are able to recognize the abundance of gifts that are in the community that has gathered, and honor those gifts and welcome those gifts and figure out humbly how to work those gifts together towards something that the community has discerned. So again, if we're intentional, we can take this idea of conspiring protagonists and have it be something that helps us resist the racism in our society. And we know the racism in our church. We know our church is a racist church, right? So if the driving impulse of racism is to divide us through fear of the unknown and suspicion, a kind of an anti-racist synodality can build up relationships of trust and relationships of empathy across the things that divide us. If racism operates with a fixed mindset that says, look, this is the way things always are, they can't change. These are the skill sets I have. I can't learn and grow. We are locked into some kind of dynamic that is bigger than our ability to change. If that's the mindset that racism often equips all of us with, synodality is a growth mindset and says, no, people can learn. Ideas can change. People can collaborate to change structure. Change is indeed possible. We can believe in the power of people to change. If racism fuels reactivity, anti-racist synodality fuels discernment. Reactivity is quick and unreflective, and often very impulsive and individual and performative. Synodality is about quietude. It's about prayer. It's about a kind of intentional dialogue. It's about coming together to figure out what is actually happening and what is the Spirit, how is the Spirit calling us to respond. And I'll say one last thing, and then we'll see where we'll maybe put you into, see if people have questions and then put you into some little groups. I think racism attempts to create unity through uniformity. And I think all people in a racialized society experience that, this expectation that you are to be the same as these other folks. And I think what we're learning in synodality is that synodality creates unity through plurality. There is space for a multiplicity of expressions and understandings of God and of ritual and of seeing the world. And the commitment is just to continue to walk and to create a path where that plurality is able to move forward together. That is the antithesis of a racialized society. So I've just said an awful lot. I've talked an awful lot at you. So I'm going to see if there's any quick questions for clarification, and then I would like to maybe put you into some breakout rooms, and I'll give you some prompts before you go in there. But any questions or anything that I said and all that I said that just needs clarification or didn't land clearly?
Just when you say church, I think you have to clarify, are you talking about all churches? You know, church is a very wide thing. And
it's an expansive term.
Yes, I think the term has to be more clear. Our religions, what do you mean? Our religions, our beliefs, or what?
Thanks for that, Sister Peg. So in this context, I'm talking about our Catholic Church as people of God. Right.
And so Catholic Church.
Yes.
You're defining that as racist.
Yes.
Other churches will have to define themselves. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that that's for me to do in other traditions. This is my tradition. So yeah, I think from my perspective and some of the research I've done, that's a conclusion that I've come to. And I believe people of color who have told me that based on their experience as well. Right. But again, the invitation is to a growth mindset, right? Like that is not the worst thing that can be named, that we could be called. The worst thing that we could be called would be people who are aware of that and do nothing about it, or people who refuse to even acknowledge that. And again, I think the Synod is creating some space both for us to do that kind of acknowledging and then to discern together what we might want to do about that. Okay. Great. I appreciate that question. So let's do this. I'm going to let me find my notes so that I can put them in the chat. I have a couple questions for you, and thanks to the person who dropped in a link to my book. I appreciate that. I had that in my thing and I didn't I didn't get it to you. So here we go. Into the chat come some questions for you all. So I'm going to put you into small groups of 3. When you get in there, introduce yourselves and then decide who's going to speak first, second, and third, and maybe select somebody to be a timer because you're going to be in these rooms for 10 minutes. And I would like you, each person can share for 2 minutes on either of the questions that I have listed here. And then you can use the remaining time to talk with one another. Okay, so each person will get two minutes, go around your group. That should leave you with a couple minutes to talk together at the end. So first question for you could be, how has racism reinforced your own sense of being an isolated conscience? Right, I mapped out some of those ideas from Francis. So have you experienced that notion of being an isolated conscience, and can you think or identify in your own lived experience how racism played a part in having you play that part of an isolated conscience? And then the second would be, what aspects of becoming a conspiring protagonist through synodality most resonate with you? So when you go into your breakouts, those questions should be there for you. It shouldn't, they'll go with you. And let's see, let me get this. So we're going to have 8 breakout rooms. There'll be 3 people in a room. So is everybody good with what we're going to do? And you'll be back at 7:47. All right. Okay, here we go.